to let you chew because I'm going to call on you next. So we also have with us today Rebecca Staub, who's a legal services advisor, coordinator for Iowa CASA. So she develops a lot of the policy there at the agency and also does a lot of trainings and advisement on those issues. So maybe from your legal perspective, if you could talk about SART teams. And
the one thing I can tell you that I see in counties where there is an existing SART team is that the tremendous amount of teamwork that goes on between the advocates and the same nurses and law enforcement and prosecution, it just flows. It flows so much better. We see in those counties they tend to prosecute more sex crimes. There's not kind of that butting heads between law enforcement and advocates that we do see in some counties where that connection or that relationship isn't there. Cinnamon, I'm so glad they have you because the counties that have the victim witness coordinator, I mean, wow, do they just make everybody's life easier? And I wish we had them in all 99 counties because you guys do such valuable work. But that's the thing that I really do see. I mean, I can tell you that there are counties in the state of Iowa where they never ever prosecute a sex crime ever. Ever. They do not exist, they don't happen, they don't get prosecuted. And that is very frustrating from the victim services perspective because we do see victims that will come forward and they do want their case investigated and they do want prosecution to happen, and when that doesn't happen, it is so frustrating for them that they feel like, okay, what was the whole point of me having a rape kit done? What was the whole point of me calling the police? Nothing's happening, nothing's, I'm willing to put myself out there publicly and say, this happened, even though I know it's going to happen to me, right? My character is going to be on trial more than my alleged perpetrator. But I'm willing to do that because I want to see my case come to completion. And it's not the same, you know, all victims are different. There are lots of victims that don't want to get anywhere near prosecution or a courtroom. They don't need that kind of closure to deal with what happened to. But for the victims who do, it's a really hard pill for them to swallow when people don't believe them or they don't see anything happen. So in the counties where we do have SART teams that already exist, it's good to see that because they're having direct contact immediately at the hospital with the nurse, the advocate, law enforcement comes, everybody comes, introduces themselves, says, you know, you don't have to talk to me right now, but here's my card, you can call me later. But we do see an increase in prosecutions in those counties for these kinds of crimes. And so I think from our standpoint, it just makes the whole process seem to flow together better.
Right. And it's really the use of the team. And when you have new people on board, it's really important to make sure everybody sort of is familiar with each other, because even the sexual assault that I had yesterday in Mid-Iowa SART in Polk County, we do a pretty good job at making sure that we have a real team approach. But we had a couple new advocates yesterday that I asked them to call law enforcement, and they're like, but she's not going to. Do you want her just to come and pick up the kid because she doesn't want to report? I was like, it's not our job to decide if she's going to report. The officer needs to introduce himself and to be there to let him know, or to let her know from his perspective, what he can offer that victim, and leave a card and a place that she can contact him when she's ready to tell her story, if she's ever ready to tell her story. But she came to us for a sexual assault kit, so she must have wanted something for some reason for the future or whatever. But yeah, it's really important, I think, and the way we do our protocol and the way we set up our team and how its response is different than other counties that Rebecca and I have been to visit around the state. They do things differently because our advocate actually initiates the whole process, where in other places it's the SANE or the law enforcement. But our advocates in Polk County, they're the ones that get called by the hospital, and then they mobilize the SANE and the law enforcement, and so we all kind of arrive about the same time. But I think advocates make our job easier. I think the SANEs make the law enforcement's job easier, because victims are more cooperative with law enforcement by the time they're ready to talk to them after they've already been with a SANE and with an advocate. So I think it takes a team, and it's just really important that everybody function as one.
And what I remember of yesterday's experience when she said she's not going to make a report, Kim's answer was, but he's on our team. And so I like that response, right? You know, that's right. He's a team. That person's a team member and needs to be with the team. It doesn't matter if she's going to report or not.
Yeah.
And
so advocates don't make that decision. SANEs don't make the decision if law enforcement's going to be called in, because you're team members and you get to make that decision when you get there with the victim, whether or not she's going to talk to you now or later or whatever. I mean, it's the victim's decision, but law enforcement needs to be there to offer their services and their name and their card, and you know that they're sorry that she's here too, just like the rest of us. And I think that's why victims are more cooperative.
Yeah, and that's the key piece. Is, I mean, ultimately everything is the victim's choice. So when the different parties show up, that victim is given the choice of whether or not they want that person to come in and introduce themselves or talk to them. Now, and I don't know, it could be totally different here, but in Polk County, the officers that are showing up at the hospital, you know, are the officers working the street. They're and they can't stay there for hours, so they typically come in knowing most of the time that victim's not going to make a report right then and there, but they'll come in, ask to be introduced. They introduce themselves, say, this is how we can help you. I understand you don't want to talk to me right now, that's fine, but here's my card. If, you know, in a week or a month or 6 months, if you want to call and talk about your case, give me a call. And then they'll leave, and then they'll actually send somebody in just to pick up the kit to take possession of that for evidence once the kit is completed. So it's not like they're hanging out there the whole time because frankly they don't have the time to be able to do that if there's other calls and things happening that they have to respond to. But it's still getting that whole team together and having all the options there and available. Because that victim might think that he or she doesn't want to talk to police when they first show up, but then when that officer maybe introduces themselves and kind of helps to put that victim at ease a little bit, then they're more likely later to come back and say to their advocate, hey, I really like that officer that responded, I want to file a report, can we call them, will you go with me? You know,
and if the victim sees that relationship between the law enforcement and the SANE and the advocate too, that they obviously all have a team approach and they have that relationship that's already between them, then I think they see them as differently as well. Now each community kind of does their interviews a little bit different too, because Story County, they believe in team interviews, so the SANE and law enforcement interview victims together. Most places in the state and the team that I'm on, we do not do those together because we have more of a concern about testifying, that if we're testifying, then it becomes a real issue for the SANE if our interviews have been with law enforcement at the same time. So we do ours separately, but we of course don't have to get the kind of facts that detectives get either. You know, we need to know more medical sort of information. We try and keep it at that for our testimony, because we will all be called at some point. But Story County, that's working for them right now. But it's up to you how you want to do that. And since you do have somebody from the court that sits on your team here, that's probably a really good idea to talk about victim services. If that's something that you really want to do or not, doing those joint interviews.
Some of the things we'll be figuring out together as we move through this. Anybody have questions for any of these three?